Good morning, everybody. My name is John Campbell. I'm the producer of external development for BioWare. BioWare's been putting voices in games for almost 20 years, and we've had a lot of success recently working with Pull to Win and Side. So really, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Jacquie Shriver Sladeck, the head of Side LA.
Typically, the first thing I do when I welcome someone new to our studio in Los Angeles is to offer them coffee, tea, water, or a restroom, none of which I have on me right now to offer you, so I'm a little on the back foot without my standard opening line. But now that you're here and hopefully not in need of facilities or refreshments, I want to talk about outsourcing pipeline and voiceover. By the time you leave here today, I'd like you to have a clear understanding of how your partners can work with you at all stages of development to give you the best results and the biggest bang for your Canadian or American buck, or euro, pound, lira, whatever you got. The ideas I present are framed within the voiceover pipeline, but can be scaled across all outsourcing partnerships. So this is me, Jacquie Shriver Sladeck. I'm the head of studio at Side LA, which is part of Pull to Win. We're the audio outsourcing brand for character performances for video games. We bring your story to the world. Video game dialogue is literally the only thing I've done professionally in my entire life, starting at Sound Deluxe Design Music Group in Hollywood, and through to Salami Studios, also on the outsourcing side, and then a 10-year stint at Sony PlayStation on the development side. In my time at Sony, I had the honor of working on a variety of projects, including the entire God of War franchise, the Order 1886, Spider-Man, Days Gone, a slew of SOCOM games, just to name a few. And since I've been with Side since 2016, I've had the opportunity to work with dozens of developers of all shapes and sizes all over the world. I was compelled to put this talk together because as outsourcers, we have the unique ability to compare notes about how different teams work. And, pardon me, there are a few things that remain true no matter the size of the project, but there are always opportunities to improve efficiency. Inevitably, your goal is to use your outsourcing dollars effectively. So let's get started with a quick look at the pipeline itself. So the dialogue pipeline is not a set linear thing. It's more like a subway system. It loops back around on itself in a variety of ways, finding different paths each time. Often, teams who outsource will wait until they're very far along in production to involve their partners, where others have long-standing, ongoing vendor relationships and do the same process again and again. So let's think about best practices for involving your partners along this pipeline, the right times and the right topics that lead to the deepest collaborations and the biggest wins. So the title of the talk is Where to Invest in Your Dialogue Pipeline, and the truth, of course, is that's entirely dependent on what you need to do. Every decision you make, every priority your team decides, it all impacts your cost and timeline as well as your quality bar. It's important to provide your vendors with the best possible information, your budget, your priorities, your technical requirements and wish lists, your milestones, your deadlines, your marketing requirements, what you're worried about, what you're confident about, everything that's kind of been collected until the point of involving your partner. So now let's get a little more specific about investing in your pipeline. The first pass of a budget or schedule is very rarely representative of where you wind up at release. Going about the scoping process from a few different angles gives you an opportunity to uncover your own weaknesses and expose areas for improvement and increased collaboration. So what do I mean by scoping from a few different angles? I mean taking your scope as you currently understand it and defining it using different metrics or perspectives. Meaning, don't just think about your dialogue in terms of words and lines and numbers of characters, but instead, how complex or the number of quick time events you have that have dialogue that are going to need to be timed and figured out. Does your sound design team have a connection to your narrative team and have their assets sort of partnered along with the things that they're writing? Basically, is everyone in alignment on timelines and needs on your side before you involve a partner? Understanding the entirety of your scope before production begins provides an opportunity to find savings of both time and money. So as an example, we have one client who consistently provides us with an accurate picture of what they're bringing to us for each bit of recording, and including when we're going to receive scripts and assets, and the keyword there is accurately. They've also determined their own internal pipelines so they know when they need each thing back on the other side of their recording sessions. And with all this information, we as the vendor can take all aspects of their scope into account in creating a budget and then a production schedule. By the time we get to recording, there are no big surprises, and at this point, we understand the volume and complexity of their needs. When we know this, we can create an accurate budget that we rarely deviate from with this particular client because the quality of the information is so good. So as you can see, or maybe not, depends on if you read stuff like this frequently, we have a clear understanding of their total scope. To get here, though, our client had to really dig in and discover their own internal pipeline and understand when they would have materials ready for recording, when they needed them turned back around, when they would have video materials ready for us. They also had to determine their own internal delivery priority so that we knew where to put things so that they got their stuff back as quickly as possible. This kind of investigation and the corresponding documentation gives your vendor the best possible chance to quote accurately and provide the most efficient production schedule. And I mention this at all because we frequently get RFQs with the most basic information. And taking something complicated and distilling it into something simple can be very useful at times, but it doesn't give you a full understanding of the undertaking. And it can lead to misleading or undercooked quotes. We often receive RFQs that contain information that will lead to a best-case scenario, which is unlikely to actually represent the full project in the end. So here's an example of some information we've received that doesn't really paint a full picture. We have some numbers, only a very little tiny bit of context. Providing vendors with a few other bits of information about these lines and characters will allow us to truly understand the undertaking. And if you find then that the quotes you're receiving back are out of alignment with your own internal budgets, you'll have a much better understanding of the causes of those misalignments, which in turn allows your vendors to rescope iteratively until you have something that works for both your vision and your budget. Another example of partial or incomplete scoping relates to milestones. Milestones cause inefficient recording sessions, and that's just a fact of production. Many projects will scope as though everything will be ready at the same time, and then find their budget balloons when tiny bits of recording are required to hit those milestones. An example will be adding hours of recording that you hadn't planned on until later in the project because certain characters or features absolutely must appear in your milestone build. In this case, for example, the result is a 7% budget increase, which for a tiny team is not insignificant. So if you have milestones in your schedule, they should be part of your scoping exercise, and you should share them with your partners. They may be able to help mitigate some of those unavoidable costs and spending that comes with delivering milestones. So here's what's actually really important here. The more you know about your project and the more you understand it, the easier it will be to communicate those ideas with your partners, who can in turn generate budgets that work with yours. For my second point, I would like to discuss goals. Here we've moved on to pre-production. During this crucial process, it's imperative to make sure your goals are clear and well-defined. As service providers, we completely understand that you need your assets back with the highest possible quality, under budget, on time, full stop. But how many of you have had to change direction mid-project because of projected timelines or budget scopes? It happens to everybody. The reality of your internal deal breakers for both money and time is rarely known until the scoping and quoting process. It's a good idea to track and define those goals and priorities, including what you've been willing to give up. This can be really important information for your partners. We often have clients, as an example, we often have clients come to us with requests for high-profile talent. And that's a kind of negotiation that can be tricky. It takes time, effort, nuance, and it costs a lot more. So a small project with a small budget wanted to approach highly recognizable talent. And we had an in-depth conversation with them about what their goals were for this approach, instead of just making the approach. In the course of that conversation, we figured out what their actual goal was only a few lines of dialogue and a bit of a social media boost. We discussed the likely cost of the particular person they were interested in, the amount of time it would take to put together pitch materials and negotiate and contract, and found out it was wildly outside their goals for the overall project. But because of this conversation, we found a different profile-ish talent who worked much better for this specific project. Someone who was passionate about games, wanted the opportunity like this to support a small developer. They were cost-effective and had enough social media following that they definitely achieved the goals of this particular project. But of course, since we understood the goals of the client, we were able to work together to achieve them in the fastest and most efficient manner possible. So the point is, without guidance, we as vendors have to assume what your goals are. With additional information about what's important to your project, we can create more than a quote, but a plan of action, one that's aligned with your visions and your restrictions. So now that we know what we need to do, let's make sure we have the tools to do it. One inspiring aspect of working in the video games industry is the constant breakneck speed of innovation. The bigger games get, the more complicated but useful our tools become. So in addition to understanding your scope and your goals, we need to understand your tools. Side, and of course many other vendors, build tools and create processes based on how specific clients give their assets to us. If you have an internal pipeline that requires certain applications or methods, we need to make sure we can work with what you give us efficiently. The best way to do that is to share documents, tools, apps, and so on with us early on and keep us updated as they build and change. Many tools built to handle game dialogue, of course, are designed to work with a game engine and not with a recording studio. Game engines need one set of information, and directors and actors need quite another. But having access to your tools and their output will allow your vendors like us to adapt, and in some cases provide opportunities for improvements in the recording studio. That kind of assessment and adjustment can often take time, though, and should be built into the overall timeline for the project, especially with really big projects. With enough time to properly ingest, though, we can create a pipeline custom built for your project that makes everyone's life easier. Without that visibility, though, you can be tripped up by the natural and expected changes that take place during production. So as an example, we had one team whose dialogue tool output the script in alphabetical order by character, with no obvious way to reorder it back in a narrative order. We received the script the morning of the session and had no choice but to pick and choose which lines to record with actors who are already in the session. It was a really crappy first day of recording, and it led to a really tired game writer who had to spend their entire evening reordering the script so that we didn't waste the rest of the week burning through time. But a work in progress script about a week ahead of time would have allowed us the opportunity to point out that bottleneck, find a solution, potentially take that work on ourselves so that there would be no major disruption to the recording session and the resulting voiceover. We have teams also who have integrated tools that handle their scripts, their voiceover assets, subtitles, localization data, all that good stuff. At the beginning of a specific project, they were exporting the script from the tool and handing it to us, and we would update it, and we would hand it back, and then we would get the voiceover assets ready, and then we would hand it to them, and they would put it into the tool, and we all figured out that that was redundant, and we just asked them for some training on the tool. And they gladly trained us, and we ended up being able to not only be more efficient with just getting data into a tool, but with script preparation, because we were interacting with it directly, with recording, actual exporting at the end of session, and even with delivery, everything improved because we were able to actually interact with the tool. Final case study on this point. We have one client with a custom script tool that's really complicated, managing branching dialogue and nonlinear situations. Very early on in production, they provided us with a work-in-progress partial script. From this, we generated a tool that overlaid on top of their script format that allow us to track recording progress, to adapt to changes and additions into the script without creating a whole bunch of extra work that's really natural and normal in our world. We were able to create this tool, and we wanted to create this tool so that we could work with what our client gave us without requesting that they change anything. So they were able to use their tool in the way that made the most sense to them, but we were able to continue to be efficient in studio, even though that tool didn't make a lot of sense at the beginning when we first received it. Of course, I want to mention that I'm not blind to the fact that a lot of internal tools are proprietary and confidential, and it doesn't make sense to share them with your partners. But when it does, it can actually make both of your lives a lot easier. It's the kind of investment that won't significantly impact your budget or as a line item, but will absolutely increase efficiency. So for the last point I'd like to highlight lives in production as well as post-production, and that is the stress test. It's particularly important for large projects, but the underlying idea can be scaled, and that is to put your practical assumptions to work. Obviously, time is money in the studio. And by this point in the pipeline, you've discussed a lot of specific aspects of production, but no recording has actually taken place. A stress test will provide the best results if it actually encompasses all of the reality of production. This is not the best case scenario. This is the real deal with real people, all missing very real deadlines. The stress test should be a snapshot that gives all disciplines and dependencies a chance to adjust to reality. And I've lost myself. And the best idea is to give all disciplines and dependencies a chance to adjust to that reality by including everything that you can foresee happening in an actual session. If you're recording to picture, make sure your team is delivering picture. If you need 2 actors in the booth at the same time, do that. If you want to have multiple microphones, do that. During this ideally short but practical session, the idea is to break your best laid plans and find out what your weaknesses are. The best case scenario is that you can increase your expectations for output. And your worst case scenario is to have actual metrics from reality from which to adjust without rushing into large-scale production or through your budget right off the bat. So as a case study, we had a branching dialogue project with multiple actors in the booth at the same time, recording to motion capture footage data, decided to do a short 1-day session about 3 weeks before the start of production. The director and the actors were able to meet and set expectations. We were able to ingest some materials that were the same as we were going to get later in production. And our post-production team actually also had the ability to get some actual files through the pipeline to the spec that the client had discussed. During the stress test, we uncovered the following. The client needed to adjust how they were delivering scripts to us for readability in the studio. They needed to decide on a microphone because they realized they didn't want to have to deal with 2 sets of data on the back end. They realized that the quality of the temp audio on their motion capture footage needed to be much, much better in order to be effective. And as the studio, we actually found that we could decrease the amount of prep time that we had quoted based on the reality of how the team was actually interacting with video in the session. Ultimately, the start of main production 2 weeks later was markedly more efficient than the stress test had been. We were able to get through complicated material twice as fast as we had the first time around. All parties understood what the other parties needed what the other parties needed in order to be efficient before, during, and after the sessions. We avoided the panic of changing course during session, which is such bad tone in the studio, and of course the pain of discarded prep work. Everyone knew what to expect going forward. It's also a good idea to test that post or editorial pipeline. Voiceover assets and monitoring and mastering levels can be very nuanced, and we want to make sure we get it right. So the opportunity to have a little bit of finished work before we go into large volumes of editing is really, really valuable. This is also true for naming conventions and mastering levels. There are a lot of unconfirmed assumptions that can lead to delay of delivery or redoing of work that can be easily avoided with tests and samples based on actual recording. So, the takeaway? A stress test is a very small investment, in some cases, to bring 2 teams into alignment while still being productive. It allows everyone a glimpse of the rest of the project and gives time to adjust and prepare so that production does not stumble out of the gate. So, to sum all of this up, just like any other healthy relationship, the vendor-developer relationship requires quality communication. At the scoping stage, we want to know exactly what we're going to be doing together. At the pre-production stage, we want to know what your goals are. In production, we want to know how you work and how we're going to work together. And in post-production, we want to make sure your assets go seamlessly into your build. No matter the size or shape of your team or pipeline, effective and practical communication about your scope, goals, and tools, alongside realistic testing of our methods, can turn finite resources into infinite possibilities. So thank you.